Here we go, going live.
What to do to make all my Lunker Lake dreams come true.
Hello everybody, Bob Lusk, the Pawn Boss, coming at you live from the balmy headquarters of Pawn Boss Magazine, Gordonville, Texas, near Lake Texoma. Here it is, Pawn Boss Magazine, the go-to source for all things pawn. Of course, Jason Nepstad, first up to bat from North Cackalack. Guys have been traveling quite a bit. Got several things going on. Coming off of, I guess I'm 2 weeks out from rotator cuff surgery, which I'm glad that's over with. Things are good. I've had several people email me to wish me good luck and well healing and all that, and I appreciate that. Appreciate it a lot. Matter of fact, it feels good to know that the people are thinking about you. I've got a pretty good show lined up tonight. As I was thinking about it over the last few days, I've been at a couple of places. I was asked to give the keynote address at the Society of Lake Management Professionals meeting in Memphis, Tennessee. And that was last Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then I hopped on a plane and flew down to Houston, hitchhiked a ride with Greg Grimes and Wade Bales to Galveston, and went to the American Fishery Society Southern Regional meeting, gave a keynote address there. So I'm pretty flattered that people are willing to ask me to come talk to them. And my topic was the history of pond management. Imagine that. That's kind of fun. Trana Madonna, you're in there. I see that. Matt Rails checking in. Frank James, Troy Todd, Mike Cottrell, Clayton Bounds. Good evening, everybody. Glad to see we got a pretty good audience going on. Got about 20 people up. Danny Mack, good evening, Bob from 48 in Central Texas. Brad Rom from the frozen tundra of Ohio. You don't live in Ohio, dude. You live in Antarctica. You know, this polar vortex thing, we hear about that all the time this time of year, and a lot of people don't know what that is, and so just it's going to tie into some pond management stuff too, by the way. The polar vortex is a whirling, spinning mass of air that sits around the North Pole, and as long as it's moving pretty tight and fast, it doesn't drop. But when the speed drops, it drops. And so a chunk of that polar ice cap type wind has dropped down over the northern United States, and you guys are getting a dose of it. It's kind of hard looking there. We got, holy cow, Daniel Hendrick, Jaden Roberts, John Funk from Chile. Is this the same John Funk that was worried they wasn't going to get any ice on the water? Yeah, well, you're not going outside for a few days. At least I wouldn't if I were you. Tom Davis checking in from Ohio. Matt Singley from Foxworth, Mississippi. You guys know the drill. Hashtag Pawn Boss Magazine in the comment section. Click like and share this video to your timeline. Do that right now for me if you would, so we can keep building an audience of new people. We really want to spread the word. So if you guys will do that, it'll make you eligible in a drawing for a Pawn Boss cap and a Pawn Boss mug. Keeps hot things hot, cold things cold, and it don't know how it does it either. So I want to talk a little bit tonight about, I'm going to dig just briefly into the history of pond management. And Matt Rails on here watching this show. And Matt, you may want to chime in with something. If it's up to you if you want. But Matt asked me, along with Greg Grimes, to talk about the history of pond management. And their thought process was that there's a lot of lake and pond management companies scattered around the nation, and they really don't know how young the history of this pond management industry is. So they asked me if I'd go back in time and dig through some of my archives, find a few photos and some memories. So I did that. And to kind of tell you a little bit, just briefly about that, I started as a fisheries biologist in 1980. Started January the 1st, 1980. So I'm now in my 40th year as a private fisheries biologist with zeroed in on the pond management business. That's what I love. I love to help people design premier fishing lakes and ponds. I get to travel the nation to do that. And it's really, really, really fun to do. Now, if you guys got some questions, put them out there because I'll take some time to answer some questions. But the main thing I want to do tonight, the main topic I want to cover tonight is that I want to tell you about some of the tools that you have out there that you may or may not know that you've got. And I thought I'd start that off by digging back down. Back in the 30s or 40s and 50s, H.S. Swingle, who was a professor, Dr. Swingle over at Auburn University, was doing what he could to figure out ways that people could have more protein. Because coming out of the Depression, even in the Depression, one of the big deals is there wasn't any food. Wasn't enough food to go around. And so I'm going to give you just a few pieces of the puzzle that came together to create the need for a pond management industry. And so what he did was he figured out the relationships between largemouth bass and bluegill, and we use those relationships to this day. He figured out, bass crowded, bluegill crowded, what balance meant. And then all the transitional opportunities, after fish kills or first stockings and all that sort of thing. That's what he did. He figured all that out over probably a 3 to 4 decade career as a professor at Auburn. And while all this was going on, starting in the 30s, public lakes were being built. Now, one of the things that came out of the New Deal with funding was to build reservoirs. And reservoirs, public lakes, Lake Mead was built, I think, starting in, if I remember right, like 1936. It was under construction, or nearly somewhere in 1936. It was being built. And the purpose for that lake was water to drink, hydroelectric power, okay, and other lakes around the country. Part of the reason they were built was for flood control. So that was the three main reasons that big lakes were built. They were built starting in the late 30s, going into the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And by about the end of the 70s, for the most part, those projects were finished. Now, another piece of the pond management puzzle, these public lakes, back, when they were built, there was a magnet for people to go catch fish. So they did. And then, a lot of them were stocked. Some of them weren't. But there was another industry being established at that time, the bait business. A lot of bait dealers around the nation would go trap bait from rivers and streams. But then there was a company called Anderson's, I.F. Anderson's Fish Farm over in Lone Oak, Arkansas. They got into the bait production business, aquaculture, in 1946. And they continue to this day. As a matter of fact, the Andersons were there at the SLMP meeting, got to sit down with those guys, father and son, and got to talk to those guys. Well, move forward a little bit, we get into the 60s and 70s. That's when Dr. Dick Anderson figured out things that we pond managers use to this day about bass, bluegill relationships at a different level. He figured out relative weights, PSD, RSD. Dr. Anderson is still alive. He lives down in Houston. I talk to him about once a month. And well, maybe not quite that often, but I talk to him quite often. As a matter of fact, I may call him tonight and just see how he's doing. He's in his 80s, and he loves to talk pond management stuff. He's just as sharp as he can be and still loves it. So now we get into the 70s. There's really no pond management companies. By the mid to late 70s, there's a couple of companies springing up where aquatic plants are dominating the waterways. That's Florida, to some extent Georgia. But by then, aquatic plants were getting to be a nuisance. As a matter of fact, I think that was the Water Hyacinth Control Society was formed in 1961. That later became the Aquatic Plant Management Society. So by the mid-70s, there were a couple of companies that were starting to pop up and turn into pond management stuff. But you know what? In 1980, when I started, that was the year the state of Texas stopped giving away free fish. That was a big deal because up until then, if somebody wanted fish in Texas, and most states, by the way, all they had to do is get in touch with the local Game and Fish Commission, and they would supply fish, bass, sunfish, maybe not bluegills, green sunfish in Texas was what it was most of the time, and some channel cat. And all you had to do is prove that you had either built a brand new pond or that you were renovating a pond. So all that started in 1980, where people had to start buying fish. So if they were going to buy fish and pay for them, by about the mid-80s, the things were beginning to develop to where if they were having to buy fish to stock a pond, they wanted to take better care of those fish. So they did. And it was what's really interesting. I was telling this, watching the eyes of the crowd when I was at SLMP and then even at the American Fisheries Society last week during that week-long stint. What I'm going to tell you now, I saw some eyes get big because they didn't know that. There were no commercial sport fish hatcheries routinely available anywhere in the United States where you could go buy them wholesale until about 1984 or 85. So in 1980, 81, 82, if we needed to stock some fish, I could buy largemouth bass and I could buy bluegills from Hartley Fish Farms up in Kingman, Kansas to the north of us about 6 hours. Now, Bus Hartley doesn't get enough credit. Bus has been gone quite a while, but Bus Hartley in the 50s and 60s is the guy that cracked the nut on how to artificially spawn channel catfish fingerlings. And he was willing to share that knowledge and what he learned. And not only did he figure out how to spawn those babies, he figured out what to feed them. If you think about that, there was no reason to be a food on the market, any kind of fish food for channel catfish, because nobody knew about that. Well, Bus Hartley figured that out in the 50s and early 60s, and then that technology spread into the Mississippi Delta region, and in the early to mid-60s is when the aquaculture business really took off. And it took off over there on some of the bigger farms along the Mississippi Delta because they were looking for alternative sources of income and alternative crops that they could use, like when the price of rice would drop or the price of soybeans would fall. You know, then they could go in and build some pretty dadgum cool levees and ponds, and they had water. All they had to do was punch a well in the ground 45 or 50 feet deep, and they had all the groundwater they could get. So that's how the aquaculture business was spawned. So now another thing happened. In 1967, this insurance salesman from Montgomery, Alabama was fishing at, oh crud, I can't remember that lake. Ross Barnett Lake outside of Jackson, Mississippi. 1967. Now, Ross Barnett Lake was built in full in 1965. So it's only 2 years old when this insurance salesman from Montgomery, Alabama started going over there to go fishing. Well, he was over there in March with one of his fishing buddies, and a rainstorm came through, lightning. They got off the water, as we all should do. Well, Ray Scott went back to the motel, and he was watching basketball. And I've heard him tell this story. He's told it to me one-on-one 4 or 5 times. They went back to the motel, turned the TV on, and what's going on in March every spring? Basketball. So the NCAA tournament was happening. He was watching it with his pal. He said, you know, they have tournaments for these basketball games. Why in the world can't we have a tournament for fishing? So that's, and I love it. He says, I had a brainstorm and a rainstorm. So that's when the concept of bass fishing tournaments really kicked in. Now, granted, there were some local bass clubs around the nation individually that were having bass tournaments. There was a club in Texas that had tournaments in the early 60s. But Ray Scott is the guy that created a nationwide phenomenon called BASS. Now, that first bass fishing tournament happened on Beaver Lake, 1967, in near Springdale, Arkansas, northwest Arkansas. And in order to do it, Ray went on a leave of absence from his insurance business, and he needed a few dollars to fund this thing. So he went to the Chamber of Commerce to see if they would endorse it, and then they were skittish of it. Some insurance salesman coming out of Alabama to try to talk us into doing something we've never heard of. They weren't too keen on it. But what he did find is he found a local businessman that was a physician that was willing to loan him enough money to have this tournament. So he bought a Watts line, which back then that was early 800 number stuff. You know, because you got to remember, long distance was 25 cents a minute, guys, and it was from a landline. So Ray manned the phones and started planning for this first all-American bass fishing tournament. Well, in order to really make enough money with entry fees and things, he needed at least 100 anglers. Well, it didn't take long that a group of anglers from a fishing club in Memphis, Tennessee signed up, and Bill Dance was one of those guys. And then there was another team from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So pretty soon, he started putting out press releases talking about this fishing tournament. It was going to be Memphis against Tulsa. Well, as he was getting down to the wire, he heard about this guy in Texas that might be able to stir up some stuff for him. And this guy's name was Ray Mursky, and I'm going to circle back to Mursky in a minute. Ray Mursky was a manufacturer's rep for a number of companies, Remington, Zebco, I think, back then. He even owned Strike King Lure Company for quite a while. And so Ray says, you know what? And he talked like this. He said, hey, Buck, yeah, I can do that for you. Well, what Ray did was he started getting on the phone. He started stirring things up, and he found 10 or 11 Texas anglers that would be willing to pay the fees and come fish the tournament. So that, Ray Mursky is the guy that put Ray Scott over the top to get the numbers that he needed. So they had that tournament in 1967, and shortly after that, Bass Angler Sportsman Society was born. And by about the late 70s, early 80s, they had 650,000 members. So here's the pieces. We had Dr. Swingle, bass bluegill relationships. We had Dr. Anderson figuring out PSDs, relative weights, RSDs, things like that, the science that we use every day. The federal government, Corps of Engineers, was building public lakes around the nation. You know, people like to fish. Ray Scott started bass tournaments. So between all those things, as they came together, people's awareness of fishing went up. Now, what Swingle did, Swingle's work was to figure out how to feed people. So a lot of the fishing that was going on in public lakes until Ray Scott came along was for meat. Catfish for meat, eat a bass, eat crappie, eat brim, whatever. That's what most fishing was about. It wasn't really for sport. I mean, crappie fishing to this day, people are going crappie fishing because they want to eat a crappie. You know, and so all these things were coming into place in the 40s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then in 1980, like I said a while ago, there were no sport fish hatcheries except for Buzz Hartley, Kingman, Kansas, who was the guy that figured out how to get catfish to spawn and make it commercially viable, which helped push that aquaculture industry into the catfish business. And so thousands, tens of thousands of acres developed over about a 15 or 18. There's Willie Howell checking in. Hey, Willie. I see Todd Austin. Craig Guffin got his magazine. John Mikulik. Good to see you, buddy. Bruce Condello listening in. Matt Rill checking back in. Hey, Freeman, sorry, I owe you a phone call. Let's do that tomorrow, man. Mike Rivers in. Liz Adams. Hi, Liz. Good to see you. So now I'm going to move into the 80s, and I was in business by then. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about that, and then I want to circle back and start tying things together. If I wanted to buy bass and bluegill, I had to go to Kingman, Kansas to Buzz Hartley's in 1980, 81. Now, 81, I got a call from Gary Valentine, who's a Pond Boss subscriber to this day. He was the state Soil Conservation Service biologist, wildlife and fisheries biologist based in Temple, Texas, for our state here in Texas. And I got a call from him. He'd found out about me, and he said, hey, listen, the state of Texas stopped giving away free fish and we'd like to figure out how to stock private ponds and lakes. Now, back then, 1980, listen to this. This is pretty cool. The Soil Conservation Service, who is now the NRCS, had estimated there were 750,000 private ponds and lakes in Texas. Now, digest that number for a minute. 750,000 ponds and lakes in Texas. That's a lot. I think there's 254 counties. In the United States, they estimated that there were somewhere around 2.5 to 3 million private ponds and lakes in the United States in 1980. Well, in 1981, Gary Valentine checked in. There's Gary Stevens. Gary Stevens knows Gary Valentine, don't you, buddy? Let's see, Frank James, I see your comment. Gerald Stein, I'll come back to you in a minute. I want to tackle this, wrap this story up a little bit. So, what Gary Valentine did was he started a pond stocking program through the local soil and water conservation districts. So what the local soil and water conservation districts did was they know all the local landowners, all the farmers and ranchers that had ponds that would like to have fish. So they would congregate the orders and then place orders with guys like me. And then I'd go get the fish. I'd have to go to Arkansas to get channel catfish from Leon Hill's Catfish Farm. And fathead minnows, I could get those from Anderson's or one or two others. And I have to go get my bass and bluegill from Kingman, Kansas, and bring them back to Texas, store them, consolidate, and then go deliver these fish, buy plastic bags, get oxygen, then drive around to these places and have fish deliveries where I might go to one place in the morning and another place in the afternoon and bag fish all day long. But it was pretty lucrative, and it was spawning, forgive the pun, the pond management business to where people were able to stock their fish ponds. Now, if they wanted to feed the fish, they didn't think about that. But if they went into their local Purina dealer at the right time, there might be an end cap with 5 bags of catfish chow on the end cap. And then, oh, well, I can feed my catfish? You know, I've heard stories about people feeding their catfish dog food once they figured out that catfish would eat it. You know, and so there were no good fish foods back then for sport fish. All the fish foods that were being developed at that point were for nutrition, for aquaculture-based fish. which would be minnows, which would be catfish at that time. And that was pretty much it in the South. So there's Kevin Bjornson. Hey, buddy. Got to see him at SLMP. Pat Williamson checking in. And so by about 1981, 82, 83, we were doing a lot of fish stockings, fish deliveries in Texas in this end of the pond management company. Now, during that time, some other guys started in the pond management company. Johnny Foster started in North Carolina, and he was managing ponds over there. He just by himself, just like I was. I was pretty much by myself. Every once in a while, I'd have an employee, but most of the time it was me. And then that was about the time that Mac McCune started in Houston. That's where Malcolm Johnson started in South Texas, in San Marcos, Texas. Now, don't mistake me here. There were no commercial sport fish farms, but there were several retail sport fish ponds. There was one down around Houston, the one in Pennsylvania. I think there was one in southwest Nebraska, maybe. There was a couple in the Midwest where just a mom and pop shop, if you wanted a few fish, you could go buy a few fish retail. But there weren't any places to speak of that would supply them wholesale. But by about 1984, 85, Leon Hill decided he wanted to get out, and he sold his business. He had two farms, the North Farm and the South Farm. Bob Hopper ran one, Mark Stevens ran the other. So he sold it to those guys, and before long, it didn't take long for those guys to see that there was beginning to be a demand for fish to stock into ponds and lakes. So now we're at about 1985, 86. American Sport Fish started about that time. Theop Inslee Fish Farm, started learning how to do feed, train largemouth bass about 1986 or 87 up in Oklahoma. So all these things were coming together. Now in 1981, 82, 83, we didn't have any tools in the pond management business. And that's where I want to go with this talk, is to talk about the tools that you have. Back then, we had fish we could stock if we worked at it. We had fertilizers, where we could fertilize ponds, because that was the deal back then, especially in the South, it was to fertilize ponds. We had one kind of fish food, because we didn't know any better that we needed anything different. And we had 4 basic approved herbicides to treat aquatic plants. And I built a crude electrofishing boat. The first one I built was in 1984. And so that was our tools. And I mean, you had to really hustle to scratch out a living. Now, as all these things were beginning to come together, another thing was happening. The 1980s, for you guys that remember, now 1980, this is pretty interesting. 1980, the prime interest rate was 20%. I was paying 2 over prime on borrowed money right out of college to try to manage a fish farm. It wasn't easy. Now, on my fish farm, it was traditionally a catfish farm, so that's what we tried to keep it for a couple of years. But when you're paying 22% interest on borrowed money, and you're having to buy catfish food, you're having to buy fingerlings, and you're having to pay yourself and maintain equipment, and you don't really understand what you're doing, and you don't understand what your market is, you got to get a bigger truck, as the saying goes. It took me about 2.5 years to realize I was out of business and bankrupt. But by then, I knew that pond management was what I wanted to do. And I'm going to stop for a minute and go back to these questions. Let's see here. John Cruid, cool, Frank. I was going to ask the same question. Not sure if I already missed the answers. No, you haven't missed the answers. So, Gerald Stein, I'll come back to you in a minute. Let's see here. Frank James, speaking of Dr. Swingle, he found that, I don't remember what PK shrimp added to 50% to bluegill biomass in the pond, yet I seldom see PK. Remind me what PK stands for. I don't remember what PK stands for. But you don't see shrimp recommending standard stocking plans. And also, Dr. Swingle found that Nutella and PK wasn't a good combination, but Cara and PK. First of all, why aren't PK shrimp? Let me see here, see if you answered that for me. I'm going to scroll down here. Ashton, yes. Maddie, Papa is talking about fish, Pumpkin. Stephen Barton's checking in. Brendan checking in, the taxidermist. Mike Augustine. Okay, I can't remember what PK shrimp is. I'm going to assume that PK shrimp is, oh Lord, they're about that big. Little bitty shrimp that come in naturally. I tell you why they're not included in stocking plans. First of all, they're not available. most of the fish that we use in stocking plans, we got to be able to go buy or be able to raise. So shrimp, the little bitty, God dang it, I'm embarrassed. I can't think of what PK means. Somebody type it in right quick. Come on, help me out here. Grass shrimp. Grass shrimp. Okay, glass shrimp or grass shrimp. Okay, I'm thinking grass shrimp. I mean, grass shrimp are all over the place, but grass shrimp are not commercially viable to raise. Now, they do work well, and back then, you also got to remember that Dr. Swingle wasn't talking about feeding fish like we do today. So we've got artificial feeds that are so strong and so well balanced that we don't have to have shrimp. But I'll tell you this, I would love to have those. Now, I find them from time to time in native watersheds, and I like them a lot. But I don't know a way to propagate them and sell them for a value that makes it worth raising them. If we can raise 40,000 bluegill in an acre of water and be able to sell those for 30 cents a piece or 35 cents a piece, what's the point when you can't raise but maybe 50 or 60 pounds of shrimp and you can't get them out of the moss or the vegetation that they eat? So that's why they're not. Now, the question is, why do they do well in one and not the other? I don't know why that is, but I do know that their mouth parts like to chew crunchy things better than they do softer things. And Cara is more crunchy. And Cara's got a little more calcium in it. And you know what? I'm going to go on a limb here. I bet you that the grass shrimp like that Cara better because what are their shells made out of? Calcium carbonate. And when you fill that Cara, or you pull some out and throw it on the ground, let it dry up, it's solid white. Okay, so now we're going to go here. Gerald, how deep do I dig a half-acre catfish pond? If you're going to want to raise those commercially and just be able to take them out then and eat them, then you don't need to be much deeper than about 6 feet. So now, here's the caveat. And since you're in Northeast Texas, you've probably got enough rain to support the volume of water that it won't dry up. So the amount of water or the depth you need is directly related to how much water you can keep in the pond. So if you have a well, theoretically, you don't need more than 5 feet of water to raise catfish, especially if you're going to raise them as a crop. Okay, let's see what else we got. Jason Nepstead, we had a complaint that we're killing the mussels because the lake has been drained down for 30 days. Do they have any benefit? Mussels do have a benefit, but here's the good news, is their larval stages are going to be in the mud. So when that lake fills back up, Jason, the mussels will come back, especially when you don't have any predators in there to eat them. So they're in the watershed or you wouldn't have them in the first place. Chuck Brinkman ordered a subscription today. I saw that. That's pretty cool. Thanks, Chuck. How's everything in Missouri? I bet you're kind of cold. Mike Cottrell, in the resource book, do you list the best places to buy chemicals and fertilizer like local feed stores and such when that time comes? Yeah, if you guys will check the resource guide, we've got all kinds of categories and all kinds of supplies and services. So the resource guide, we're going to print a new one. I don't have one laying here on my desk, I don't think right now, but we're working on the new one for 2019. It'll go out with the March, April issue, I hope. And also we have our online resource guide, which we keep updated as we go. Okay, so now I want to circle back. Now we're in the mid-'80s, and another thing was coming on where this economy was pretty strong. And there were a lot of people that, and I'm going to give you the background on this. Baby boomers, you've heard that. I'm one of those. Where after World War II, people came out and they started, they left the family farm. They went to college maybe, got a job in the city, and then worked 25, 30, 35 years. And then at some point, they've got this thing called disposable income. So a lot of these guys wanted to get back to their roots, so they went back and started buying family farms. Some of them, like Fred Bingaman, bought his family farm. You know, and Fred's on here a lot. So these family farms where, and I remember around Whitesboro what was going on then where I live. There were quite a few guys that were either men and women both that were school teachers or had a little business downtown. To this day, Hank Lovejoy's got a business downtown, and he runs cows on a farm out north of town. You know, there was a banker in town, same thing, worked at the bank. When the bank was closed, he did his job, he'd go take care of the cattle. Well, a lot of those pieces of property were bought up by people in the city who wanted to turn them into recreational ponds and recreational properties, hunting properties, fishing properties. That was a big deal. And to this day, you can go look in some of the tax rolls. You can go Birmingham, Alabama, and within 80 miles of town, just a radius around Birmingham, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Oklahoma City, Nashville, Tennessee is another one. Memphis is another one. Omaha, Nebraska is another one. Some of the bigger metropolitan areas like that, Atlanta, Georgia, good gosh, that's a huge one. You go 80 miles in a circle and look at some of the smaller communities, and there's a significant proportion of land owned by absentee landowners who live in the city and have the property in the country. So now you got all these things that are coming together, right? You've got public lakes being built, BASS was formed, the scientists doing what they've done to give us some of the tools that we needed. We had a few herbicides. Now sport fish hatcheries were popping up. Jim Malone, he was the first one to perfect triploidy for grass carp in 1982. And grass carp were starting to get to be a pretty big deal because aquatic plants were a pretty big deal. Okay, Gerald, I'll start following you. I'm going to learn a lot. Must be winging it. Most have been winging it. Okay, good. Okay, if you're going to grow them to eat, figure out how many fish you want to eat. Okay, guys, you guys that want a catfish pond, if you want to figure out how to do that, think about how many you're going to eat realistically, or if you want to share some with people, whatever. If you think that's going to be, if you might eat 500 pounds through the course of a year, that could be 250 2-pound fish. You can grow 250 2-pound catfish, harvesting them over this course of a year in less than a half-acre pond. So if you want a half-acre pond, you can do that. You can grow catfish up to 2 pounds once they start getting to that size, because they don't all grow at the same rate. Then you start harvesting and eating some of those, which you can do that. So yes, you can. So now we've got all these things coming together. We got states stop giving away fish. We got people paying for fish. I mean, even to this, back then even, it might stock $400 an acre for fish to stock a 1-acre pond. And in West Texas, you could buy land for $350 an acre. Didn't have much on it, no access to water or electricity, but you could buy land for $350 an acre in 1980. So when people started having to pay for their fish, then they wanted to start taking care of them. And as the bass fishing industry grew, box stores started popping up. Bass Pro Shops. Johnny Morris got his start through BASS. Ranger Boats. Triton Boats. Strike King Lure Company really blew up. The bait companies. All that stuff started happening about that time. And then people started realizing they could fish their farm ponds. So they started doing that. And so now we get into the mid-'80s. And that guy, remember Ray Mursky I was telling you about? Well, he was referred to me by a friend of mine in Austin. He says, Hey, Buck, I just bought this big ranch. I'm going to put a high fence around it, grow some big deer. It's got 2 nice lakes on it. And he said, I want to grow some really, really good fish. So he invited me as a very young biologist. I guess I was about 28, 29 years old, something like that. Didn't have any gray in my beard yet. So, hey, Tory Rhodes. Yeah, man, good to see you. That was a good summit. Jerry Sabert's checking in. So, Mursky gave me the first shot that I had to go do some fun things. And his comment was, he says, I don't mind spending some money. Treat it like it's your lake, but I do want results. So you got to figure out how to grow some big fish. So he and I got together, and by that time I was able to get some pure strain Florida bass from Ron Slay at Ocala Fish Farms, or Florida Fish Farms in Ocala, Florida. I'd already bought a batch of fish from Glenn Lau, who, look him up, L-A-U, he's a legend as well. He's the first guy that did underwater photography to study bass behavior in Florida. So I stocked a really cool lake back in 1983 with some of his fish. And to this day, that lake is still a pretty cool lake. So all these things were coming together. Well, now what Mursky did was, and he helped a lot of people with a lot of things. And one thing I didn't tell at the summit, I forgot to talk about this. I was kind of pressed for time. Another thing Mursky did was, by now there were probably 8 or 10 companies that I know of that were in the pond management business that were focusing more on recreational ponds and lakes. By now there was Mike Mitchell up in Colorado working on ponds and lakes and trout streams there. So we had Johnny Foster, Mike Mitchell, 3 guys in Texas. There was a guy in Georgia. Jess Chappell was going back then. He's not doing that anymore. I know he's doing something else. But bottom line, there were several of us that were zeroed in on it. And about 1991, and I mean, I was just scratching out a living. Now, oh, listen to this. Think about this. In the late 80s, there were no cell phones available. If you wanted to learn something, you had to get on the phone and call somebody from a landline on either a dial phone, rotary dial phone, or a touch tone phone, probably touch tone by then. And it cost 25 cents a minute. So not only did we pay big interest rates in the early 80s, we also paid Ma Bell 25 cents a minute to talk on the phone. So if you were going to learn something, you either went out and did it, or you tried to find a book on it, which my favorite book back then was the Second Report to the Fish Farmers, which had the best explanations of the life histories of all the different fish that I knew we needed in the pond management business. Or I could go to a university bookstore like Texas A&M or OU or somewhere if I was in the neighborhood and go look and see if there were any new fisheries books out there that had anything to do with freshwater, small waters, and there wasn't much. As a matter of fact, the very first, believe this or not, the first bass symposium studying largemouth bass was not until 1975. And I've got that book, a symposium on largemouth bass. And it was funded out of necessity because of the bass fishing industry now was about 9 or 10 years old, and it was creating a phenomenon or becoming a phenomenon that was helping create businesses. So there was enough pressure, interest, and demand to learn more about largemouth bass above and beyond, what Dr. Swingle had done in his small waters research. So a lot of cool things were going on. So I'm going to move up a little bit. 1991 was a real big turning point. Hey, there's Nick. Great Summit. Glad you were there, buddy. So in 1991, I got a call from an unemployed outdoor writer named Mark McDonald. Now, he's on Facebook, Mark S. McDonald Sr., and he's just written a very cool book. You guys need to go find his Facebook page and check him out, because that guy is an outstanding, best writer I've ever met. So Mark called me in November of 1991, and he had just been to a pond management seminar where there were 190 people in attendance listening to 2 speakers. There was a public entity guy with the extension service, and there was a private sector biologist that spoke. And after that seminar was over, half of those people stayed behind, grilling those speakers, asking them real specific questions about their situations. Well, by that time, I had a 2 4x6 inch index card files full of information. Back then, I didn't have a computer. What was that? What I did was I wrote everything down by hand on a 4x6 inch card. All the contact information, the history of what I've done with that landowner. And I had about 250 or so of those. And so Mark McDonald asked this question. He says, do you think there's a need for a newsletter on pond management? And I didn't even hesitate. I said, yeah, I know there is. No doubt in my mind there is. Well, he wanted to have a meeting. So I met him at a Whataburger on Highway 121 in Louisville, Texas. And he and I sat through the lunch rush, through the supper rush. And by the end of the day, 9 or 10 hours later, we'd come up with the concept of a little magazine that came to be called Pond Boss. So Pond Boss was born. First issue was published in August of 1992. So here we are in our 27th year of production. Well, over time, we got other companies beginning to form. There's new products coming out, new services. And, back in the mid-90s, there was bacterial products starting to show up. There was aeration. Now, aeration came from the wastewater treatment business. And it crossed over into aquaculture because that was the biggest problem in the aquaculture business. It was oxygen depletions. So part of the biologist's job or fish farmer's job was to be checking oxygen levels. So at that point, some crude oxygen meters were on the market, but you could also buy a fish farmer's test kit from Hach, H-A-C-H. You can look them up. They still have those, where you could check pH, alkalinity, oxygen levels, 5 or 6 different important parameters, hardness, phosphorus, nitrogen. So you could be checking some of those parameters of water quality, and fish farmers did that a lot. So aeration crossed over from wastewater into the aquaculture business. And then in the mid to late 90s, Todd Weidman, I think, and there was somebody else that was really zeroing in on aeration for ponds. And Aquatic Ecosystems, the guy that started that company, is the one that was he deserves a lot of credit on establishing aeration, and he did it primarily for the aquaculture business. And then it started crossing over into the pond management industry, and we started seeing all kinds of different aeration systems by the late 90s. You know, we saw bottom diffusers, circulators. There were commercial aerators that you could kick on a timer. There were fountains, some drafted shallow, some drafted a little bit deeper. So aeration began to become a pretty big deal. Microbes were becoming a pretty big deal by the late 80s. And see, by the late 90s. So by the late 90s, the thing about microbes then was everybody looked at them like it was snake oil. Because you could put some over here in this pond, they might work. Put them in that pond, they didn't. You know, and fast forward, I'm just going to keep on the timeline so I can tie all this together for you. So now we're in the late 90s. 1997, Mark McDonald came to me, and I was married, had 6 kids back then. 4 of them were in high school. I had my 4 and my wife's 2 at that time. So I had 6 kids. I was busy. And Mark says, you know what? There's this thing called a live chat. Because by now Al Gore had invented the internet. It looked like it was going to stick. You know, up until probably 95 or 96, everybody thought it was a fad. Well, look at it now, right? Okay. So, look at there. There's Paul Picard checking in from Mississippi. Joanne Pillifant. Love my Pond Boss magazine. Interesting backstory on the creation of this very informative. Thank you very much. It's a pretty interesting story. There's a lot of stories I'm not going to have time to tell, but maybe with a glass of wine and a campfire or a beer and a steak, we can talk about that one of these days. But now we get in the late 90s, and Mark wants me to do this thing called a live chat. So I said, when do you want to do that? He said, well, you know, Wednesday night's church night, Friday night's football night, Saturday, Sundays, weekends. What about Thursday? Dude, I go to football games on Thursday. Plus, I was covering high school sports for the local newspaper up here for 4 different high schools. So I had kids playing everywhere. So I said, we're not going to do that. Well, we got to talking to J.P. Greason in 1998, and he started this thing called the Texas Fishing Forum, which is the go-to forum if you want to go fishing in Texas. That's where everybody goes. And he knew the software, and he says, you guys ought to start a discussion forum. So in 1998, we started the Pond Boss Forum, Ask the Boss. And by about 2002, we had outgrown our software. So we tried to figure out how we could transition that data into new software, and it just wouldn't work. So we bought new software and restarted the forum in 2002. And man, it took a little bit of time to really kick in and take off. But within about 6 or 8 months, it started taking off. And we started seeing people coming on. Bill Cody came on. He's one of the first members. Bill Cody's microbiologist from Malenta, Ohio. Bruce Condello, he just checked in on this show a little bit ago. He's checking in. Matter of fact, that guy's one of the most brilliant fisheries minds I've ever met. And he was intimidated to ask questions for the first 6 months, which floors me to this day when he tells me that. You know, and then Greg Grimes started checking in. Actually, I think he started checking in like 2004, 5, 6 through there somewhere. But one of the most important guys to check in was Dr. Dave Willis. Now, I noticed that there was a fisheries biologist, a fisheries professor checking in, asking questions about pond management, very humble. And so I started looking and decided I better go back and find out who this guy is. So I started doing a little homework, called him up, talked to him. He said, yeah, I'm a fisheries biologist up here at South Dakota State University, and I'm fascinated with what you're doing. And what I'm seeing out there through your forum is fascinating for pond management. And Dave Willis and I became very, very, very dear friends. And one of the things Dave Willis did over time, Dave passed away in 2014, and I miss him dearly. I don't want to talk about it because it'll wear me out. But, you know, he began to build bridges between academia, agencies, and the private sector. And because of him, my name is on a chapter in the premier pond management, small water impoundment management textbook ever written. So is Mike Otto. He's got a chapter in there on pond construction. You know, and so that was all because of Dave Willis and Wes Neal, who they were co-editors. Wes Neal's fisheries biologist over Extension Service and professor at Mississippi State. So now all these things were coming together. We were starting to have more products. And then back in 2005 or 6, Some guy caught a 25-pound largemouth bass from a small public lake outside of San Diego, California. It would have easily been the new world record, but he chose not to submit it because he foul hooked it. He went and fished for that fish every day during the spawn because he could see it down 15 feet, 10 feet, whatever it was, below the surface, sitting on a nest or sitting in the same place. Well, when that picture hit the internet, it is the first time I heard the word viral, and it just blew up. And I got a call from Dr. Mark Griffin, who at that time, Mark was the main nutritionist, fish nutritionist for Purina Mills. Now, he was in charge of zoo feeds, but he was also in charge of fish foods. And he called me and says, "Hey, did you see that fish?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that fish." He says, "You know what it ate to get that big?" I said, "Yeah, I know what it ate. It ate rainbow trout." Because about every 2 weeks, the state of California would dump rainbow trout in that lake for the public to catch. And that bass figured out all it had to do was turn around, suck once or twice, and have a 12-ounce rainbow cigar down his throat of the best protein money could buy. Well, that's how that fish got big. He said, Mark said, I went to the fish market the other day, and I got a couple of 12-ounce rainbow trout, and I brought them back to the lab. I extracted the oil. I broke them down, figured out what they were made of. Can you come to St. Louis? I said, "You know what? I can be there in a couple of weeks." He said, "Well, come on." So I got myself to St. Louis, went to 1601 South Hanley, where their offices were back then, and went into his cubicle. They all had cubicles. And I had to, I'm getting distracted. Paul Picard, what picture? 25-pound bass, San Diego, California. So he had this little squeaky metal filing cabinet beside his desk. He opens it up and he's got this little Ziploc bag. Now, Debbie and I had just gotten a Yorkie, and I thought that was a Yorkie turd. I said, "You got a Yorkie?" He says, "No, stupid." He said, "This is the nutritional equivalent of a 12-ounce rainbow trout." And there were 2 nuggets about as big as my thumb in that Ziploc bag. He said, "I want to develop a fish food for that." So I said, "Man, I love that, Ed." And because by then, Hartley was growing feed-trained largemouth bass. I forgot to mention Keogh Fish Farms. They started in like 1984, 85, 86, growing hybrid stripers. You know, and so now what Griffin did was he said, "I'm going to develop this fish food." Well, about that time, I started working at Richmond Mill Lake, which is a fast-flowing blackwater lake there in North Carolina. pH 5.3, zero nutrition in it, nothing at all. And the water's flowing so fast through the sandhills that you can't lime it and you can't fertilize it. So I challenged Mark. I said, "Hey, can you work with the Aquamax lineup of feeds and refine them and make them better vitamin packages, better protein sources, et cetera, et cetera?" And he said, "You know what? I can do that." So he started working on fish foods specifically for sport fish applications. So he was the first guy to figure out some of the nutrition for bluegill and really zeroed in on largemouth bass, because most bass farms that had feed-trained largemouth bass were feeding salmonid feed, feeding trout feed, basically, which is really, really rich. It would make them gain a lot of weight, but it'd make them a funny color, almost blue, and their livers would be fat, and those fish would be just full of fat. So Griffin started changing the protein sources, changing the fat content. Hey, Craig McBride, good to see you, buddy. Leanne's checking in, good to see her. And so what happened was Griffin really started to fine-tune that fish food. And I've got some ponds at the house, and we would test that fish food at the house quite often. And he's the one that really refined Aquamax. I left out a story you're going to enjoy. Back in 1995, when Pond Boss Inc. was incorporated. Oh, one other thing. Ray Mursky, he's the guy. He loaned me $2,500 so I could loan it to McDonald to publish the first issue of Pond Boss magazine. And then I sat down and I wrote letters to all my customers to see if I could get 100 people to send me a check for $24 for a magazine that didn't exist back then. That was a starting subscription rate. And I got 92 letters back from people that were willing to invest in this magazine. And to this day, over half of them are still subscribers to Pond Boss. Well, about 3 or 4 years later, in 95, we sent a letter to Purina Mills. And they called. And we didn't know who to send it to. It was to marketing department, if I remember right, or advertising department. Well, we got a call back from them. They said, "Not only do we want to advertise in Pond Boss, but we see this pond management industry is a burgeoning industry, and we'd like to see what we can do to help. So we had a meeting with them. They came down. They met with Walter Bassano and me, and there were 3 Purina guys. 2 of them are still there. Well, one of them just retired. Gordon Ballin just retired. Brad Shue, a guy named John Meadows. I took them to this ranch where the Glen Lau bass had been stocked about 8 or 10 years earlier, and let them catch some 7, 8, 9, and a double-digit bass. And then we put the electrofishing boat in the water and let them see what they didn't catch. And then we ate, spent the night. The next day, we went to a barbecue place in Glen Rose, Texas, Hammond Barbecue, which is still there, Hammond's. And Gordon Ballin, I'll never forget it, he looked me in the eye and says, hey, what can we do to help this industry? I said, well, Dr. Ballin, there's all kinds of commercial aquaculture feed, but there's no fish food for ponds. He said, well, what do we need to do? I said, well, one thing, we're feeding different sizes of different species of fish. Can you create like a feed with different sizes of pellets? Boy, you see the little light bulbs going off on their heads. They all looked at each other and they said, yeah, we can do that. 10 days later, I had a pallet of fish food in unmarked bags that was called game fish chow. So to this day, game fish chow was birthed from an idea that Purina listened to and then acted on in a barbecue joint in Texas. And then they went back and R&D'd it. So now I'm going to fast forward 10 years, get back up to Mark Griffin. So now Mark wants to really start fine-tuning some feed where we could grow some big fish, grow them fast. So now we got fish food we can use. So by that time, there's all kinds of competition in the aeration business. You got, you can go online, go to the Pond Boss Resource Guide and look at some of them. There's Aquamaster, Vortex, Casco. The pond guy had some. Keaton was kicking in then in Colorado. So there was all kinds of companies. And now, in order to kind of justify their existence, they had to start doing some research. So they started figuring that out. So figuring out how much aeration is enough, how much is too much. And so that aeration industry now is really kicked in to where an aeration system, you may, for a 5 or 6 acre lake, you might spend $4,000 just so it's working on the 15 minutes of your pond's life where your fish would have otherwise died. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a fish kill happen to a pond that's 3 or 4 years old just because all conditions came together for there to be an oxygen depletion because something happened to the water. Aeration stops that. So now here's what we've got. We've got a much, much, much better lineup of herbicides if that's the route you want to go. You've got organic methods. You've got grass carp to control plants. You can prevent plants. There's lake dyes out there that are designed to help minimize penetration of UV rays down to the bottom to keep plants from growing if you do it at the right time. Fertilizers, people are starting to get away from fertilizers because now we're seeing that there's harmful algae blooms going on. Blue-green algae, 4 or 5 different kind of filamentous algae, Lingbia that we don't like. The harmful algae blooms are growing primarily because there's an imbalance in nutrients that nobody knew about, even 15 years ago. Now there's at least 2 companies out there that are doing research on these different balances. CPRO is one of them. And then Aquafix, Landon Wyatt. Landon, my apologies, I'm trying to think of the new name. Anyway, I interviewed Wyatt on my podcast. I've also got an audio podcast. I'll tell you more about that later because I'm going to run out of time. So what I want to tell you is you've got better fish foods. The industry's now working on harmful algae blooms to better manage your water. There's better fish foods. There's a wide variety of fish species. There's hybrid crappie, there's hybrid sunfish, there's bluegill, copper-nosed bluegill, fathead minnows, golden shiners, grass carp, tilapia, hybrid striped bass. There's all kinds of fish species out there. Wintertime stockings of rainbow trout. So there's a ton of those things. Now, there's herbicides that are species-specific or family-specific to kill certain kinds of plants. So you've got things that can prevent plants. You've got ways now, if you do a little homework, where you can manage your plankton blooms. Used to, the only way to manage a plankton bloom was with an algaecide. Natural lakes. Thanks, Matt Rail. Landon Wyatt, natural lakes. Thanks. Try to remember all this stuff, and sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. So, now we've got, oh my gosh, fish feeders. Holy cow. Fish feeders were experimental up until probably the late 80s. And now, you look at places like Texas Hunter, which helps sponsor the show, by the way. They've got the best feeder on the market. You got low-end feeders, medium-end feeders, and high-end feeders. Those feeders made by Texas Hunter, they'll ship them the same day. You'll get them the next day if you want, and they don't break. Well, at some point, everything breaks, but they're the best feeders on the market. So you got competitive feed companies going on. You got a little bit of competition in the feeder business, aeration. You got microbes. You got all kinds of herbicides and products to work with your water to deal with aquatic plants. There's plants you want, plants you don't. We know that now. We didn't know that then. Mossback fish attractors. You can take, one of the big deals now is all these lakes that were built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s are getting old. And their habitat's deteriorated. So now you got companies out there that are manufacturing habitat. So when you look at it, and you hear me preach all the time, I preach all the time, there's 5 real big things. You got to take care of the water. That's the most important thing. Got to keep your water happy. If you don't have happy water, none of the other things I'm going to tell you make any difference. The second most important thing is the habitat that your fish have. We now know we can build spawning beds out of gravel. And where to put them, pretty much. Most of the time, because sometimes the fish, they might not agree with me sometimes. So there's things you can do to improve habitat. There's food chain items out there. You can bolster the food chain. You can create a food chain. You can manage the food chain. You got better foods. You've got specific fertilizers. You got better techniques. You got ways to manage the aquatic plants. Genetics, that's a big deal. You can buy Florida genetics. You can buy F1s. American Sport Fish grows F1. Several hatcheries grow F1. Tiger bass, they call them. Trademarked by American Sport Fish, by the way. So you can have good genetics, great genetics for bluegills, copper-nosed bluegill, or in your neck of the woods, your genetics are probably better because they've been there forever, and they're the ones that can get big. You mix those with some good fish food, keep the water happy, you can grow some giant bluegills over 2 pounds now. You couldn't do that 15 years ago because the feeds weren't there for that. And the fourth thing is harvest. That's a big deal. We now know, I would have told you 10 years ago, in most bass lakes, take out every bass 14 inches and under. I don't say that anymore. Now what I'm saying is we figured out that you can harvest the most aggressive fish you've got in a few months, and that's genetic, that's inherited. So if you're taking the very best fish you've got out, 3 or 4 generations from now, you're going to wish you didn't. And so now we got better harvest techniques. So you take all this science, you bring it together with really good products. And I used to say this all the time. Here's what I would tell people. I would say pond management's about 10% science and 80% or 90% art. Well, I'm going to tell you, science is expanding, and it's expanding rapidly. I've been able to watch this when there was no industry, and now it's an industry that has gone like this forever, and now here it is. And it's just about to really blow up. There's small companies buying bigger companies. There's more pond management companies around the nation now than ever before. Some of them target like Aqueduct. They've got a bunch of employees. Good gosh, those guys, their main deal is to make ponds look good. They don't do a lot of fisheries work. You go to Georgia, Florida, over there, it's more about dealing with runaway aquatic plants. You get in the middle of Georgia and then start coming west, it's about fishing ponds. There's a stormwater retention pond. It's got its own cottage industry in the pond management business. Urban ponds, homeowners association lakes and ponds. So all these different elements are coming together where we've got all kinds of new products and cool stuff to get your pond like you want it to be. So spend a little time on the resource guide, Pond Boss magazine, $35 a year. That's what fuels the economy of Pond Boss and helps make this show happen. $35 a year. If you guys haven't subscribed, I'm going to ask you to, because there's some great history there. And I noticed Matt made a comment that there's a book in there somewhere. I've thought about that a little bit. And rather than sit down and try to write a book, what I think I'm going to do, Matt, is I'm going to write a series of articles and publish those in Pond Boss, and then see if I can interview some other guys that have been along this journey with me, that I might not even know about, and see if we can start talking about putting something together that can really start tying this industry together and the history of it so people can read about it. So that's what I'm going to do. And I've been pretty excited since giving those 2 keynotes, and I was flattered to be able to do it, and I deeply do appreciate it. And I just thought it'd be kind of cool to take a minute and just take you through just a real fast-paced timeline of the last 6 or 8 decades. And the last 25 years is really, really when the pond management industry started coming together. So now it's exciting to kind of be on the inside looking out, you know, and then on the outside looking in, so you can see all of that. It's pretty cool. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget, hashtag Pond Boss Magazine in the comments. Share this to your timeline. And what's the other thing? Click like. Be eligible for a drawing for a hat and a mug. I will see you guys next Wednesday. I appreciate all the kind words. Adios until then. I don't know what the topic is, but once I figure it out, I'll let you know. See you later.